All right, everyone. So you may have heard or got the notification that I started a recording, which means we're going to go ahead and kick it off today. So thank you for joining us for our Thursday edition of Career Mythbusters. Today we will be focusing on the job search and some myths that are related to that process. And of course, we'll be busting those myths. So let's go ahead and kick it right off. So before we get started, I want to just go through some virtual communal agreements. So if you all could, as participants, mute your microphone just to ensure that we don't pick up any of your feedback. Secondly, go ahead and turn your captions on. This will ensure that you're able to hear and pick up everything that the presenters are sharing with you today. If you just scroll to the bottom of your screen, click the closed captioning button, it will actually put some captions on the screen for you. Thirdly, you as participants are welcome to keep your video on or off, but presenters will be audio only, so myself and my colleague, Lynn Meadors. Fourth, just go ahead and ask any questions via the chat so everyone can see them throughout the presentation. So if we cover some sort of a topic or say something that you have a question about, feel free to drop that in the chat box, and then we'll either address it right then and there if it's pertinent to the topic, or we'll go ahead and just save it for Q&A at the end, or potentially respond just directly in the chat. We are, as you noticed, recording this presentation to share on the UNLV Career Services website and social media accounts for future access. So if you find that this information was really valuable and you want to refer back to it, you're welcome to see it on our YouTube channel, and then also refer any friends, family members, colleagues to the same content. So without further ado, we also have a survey for today. So if you just pull that up and kind of keep it in your web browser while we go through the presentation, that would be awesome. And at the end, go ahead and fill it out. Before we get started, does anyone have any questions? I'm going to take just a moment, kind of see if anything pops up in the chat. And then if not, we're just going to power through and kick it off for today. This is that fun, like awkward sort of pause moment in webinars where you're probably giggling, but I can't hear you because of course your microphone's muted. I like to do the nice little ramble while I wait for any questions. Notice that there are none, and then proceed. So let's go ahead and kick it off today. Okay, so our hosts today, will actually be co-hosting this event. Myself, so my name is Cass Moore. I work in the UNLV Career Services office. I am a career and professional development specialist. In other words, it's a fancy name for I'm a career coach. And I work with students, alumni, faculty, and staff in developing their professional development to identify, different opportunities for themselves. And then, of course, with faculty and staff for their students. So I'll go ahead and let my co-host, Lynn, introduce herself.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And like you said, I was awkwardly laughing, but you couldn't hear it because my microphone was off. But thank you for that. I'm Lynn Meadors, as Cass said. I'm the Assistant Director for Employer Relations in UNLV's Career Services Office. So what that essentially means is that I build meaningful, mutually beneficial partnerships and relationships with our employers to help foster a hiring relationship. So that's a very complicated way of saying I help keep our employers happy so that they are more likely to hire UNLV students and alumni. So Cass and I are going to be co-hosting this today. So she'll be providing, kind of the career coach perspective, and then I'll be speaking from more of an industry perspective. And we are really excited to be here today with all of you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lynn. So the first myth that we'll be busting today is finding a job is easier when you have a job, right? So we hear that a lot, like, oh, finding a job is so much easier when you have a job. Industry professionals will say things like that. Employers will say things like that. And then, of course, your colleagues, fellow students, alumni, etc. This statement is actually both true and false, and Lynn and I are going to go ahead and explore the reasons why it is both true and false. So I'll actually have Lynn kick it off with maybe the true side and kind of explore any of those bullet points that we have to get started.
Perfect. So you'll notice with a lot of these, spoiler alert, most of these are both true and false. So there is truth to this myth and also definitely false aspects as well. So the first way that this is a true statement is because it really dictates and influences employers' perceptions of you. So having an inconsistent job history or inconsistent experience can potentially signal to an employer that you're unreliable or that you don't have the skills necessary to work in the field. It might also show to them that you can't hold down a job. They don't know from your resume or your experience why you left a position. And so if something is very choppy, it might indicate to them that perhaps you had been fired or let go from a position. So you really want to make sure that you have a consistent background to help emphasize that you are a reliable employee, and that you can bring the skills that you have to work with that employer. So with that, obviously having some consistency in your employment is a good thing. I don't think anybody would say having a choppy job history is like a desirable thing. It can help emphasize to employers that you plan to stay in a role, and also show that you're increasingly qualified for other positions by having an increased number of years of experience. So, for example, if you're looking for, a supervisor position, or you're in a field that requires a certain number of years to progress, like engineering or a lot of IT fields, it can show them that you actually have the experience needed. From a skill building perspective, it's a good idea to have a job, because you are continuing to gain skills and experience, and the more experience you have will help launch you forward to get some more opportunity. And from an industry perspective, having that continuous employment helps you to grow in your field. It can assist you in networking, and also help you to keep gaining important recommendations in your field. So to a certain extent, this is true. It is often easier to find a job when you have a job. Cass, do you have anything to contribute to that, or should we just jump over to falsehoods, which you can feel free to take over?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a good way to do that. Like, you'll either take the true or false perspective, and we'll kind of present this dichotomy. So yeah, I'll play devil's advocate here and just talk a little bit about the falsehood of this statement. So yeah, it may be false in respect to a career shift. So right, maybe you're currently working in, IT, or you're currently working in customer service, sales, but you're looking to make a transition to a different career. In that case, that experience that doesn't exist in the new industry that you're trying to move over into, it may not benefit you anyway. So potentially, right, maybe not having a job in that field at the moment and being able to dedicate more time to your job search could be beneficial, which means, finding a job may not be easier if you currently have a job. Secondly, right, you might be leaving your current position or your most recent position because it was just too stressful, right? Maybe you were too stressed at your position and it's not going to benefit anyone in that process, especially you in your job search. So maybe for you, it's better to just sort of take a breather, right, from employment, especially if you can, with like income restrictions and things like that. And, not be too stressed when you are going through your job search. So sometimes being able to commit yourself 100% to a job search may be more beneficial, meaning finding a job may not be easier when you have a job. Fourthly, right, refocusing can just help. This is coming from a career coach, right? Taking a step back to sort of refocus and determine what you truly want out of a career. Maybe taking some career assessments or skills assessments to determine where you want to go, and potentially leaving a job to look for a job might be more beneficial for you in your career journey. Something we might recommend in this space is if you are in this sort of arena of looking for different opportunities and positions, and you're just struggling to identify what might be a good fit for you, we encourage you to meet with a career coach in the career services office, or potentially take a career assessment to figure it out. And then lastly, right, sometimes you may be taking a leave from employment because you're furthering your education in something, whether that's at the bachelor's degree level, master's, PhD, and onward. Your education may be the thing that's preparing you to find a job and not necessarily work experience. So then in turn, maybe finding a job isn't easier when you have a job because you're a full-time student instead, right? Or you're gaining more educational opportunities to prepare you for looking for a job. So those are some of the reasons why this statement may be false, and that finding a job could be easier when you don't have a job. So that's sort of the dichotomy of that myth, and making it both true and false. Lynn, any final thoughts before we sort of transition?
Yeah, I have a question for you for this one. So from a career coach perspective, if you are someone who has sort of what I was talking about a choppier kind of job history, or you haven't stayed in a role for along a period of time, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later. How can you address that when you're looking to move, maybe what you were saying of like changing fields and stuff like that? How can you address that with that employer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So being very flexible and creative with your resume tends to be a huge benefit in this scenario, right? If you have a choppy work history, or maybe you're just unemployed right now for whatever reason, it could have been the pandemic, it could be because you're dedicating your time to your education and so on. And so something that we recommend to do with your resume in this case is try to make the top of your resume, or the things that sort of exist on the top half of your resume, to be the most recent activities that you are or have been engaging in. So this includes volunteer in service, maybe you're within a local or a UNLV organization, club, etc., and you have that kind of involvement within your experience. Thirdly, right, you could think about some academic projects to include in your resume, because you may be a UNLV student or a recent student. And so kind of filling your resume with projects, academic experience, volunteer, leadership, service could be one way to kind of offset the fact that you're either not employed right now or you have sort of a choppy history. Second to that is I would definitely recommend talking about that in a cover letter, right? So a cover letter is a really great space for you to explain to a potential employer why there may be gaps in your work history, or why there may be some choppy experience on your resume. And I know that we're going to be talking a little bit more about the choppiness or the years of experience on the next few slides. And I'll certainly provide some more recommendations on how to offset that with documents like your resume and cover letter. Does that help answer the question, Lynn?
Yeah, I definitely think so. So, I mean, you talked a little bit about, how to emphasize why you're making the transition and all of that sort of stuff. And, going back to school is a pretty hardcore reason, for maybe a choppy work history or industry transition or stuff like that. How can you address things where maybe you left a position for more of a personal reason, where what you were mentioning about your stress or your mental health, or if you have family concerns or something like that? How can you talk about that?
Yeah, so that can be a really tough one depending on who the employer is, right, that you're submitting application materials for, and who you're interested in getting hired with. But what I have found is, of course, on your resume, you can't just write, left work to be a stay-at-home mom, or, whatever, left work for mental health reasons. You can't write that directly on your resume, or I guess you could, but it's just not best practice. So something that we recommend in that space is twofold. So first, right, try to fill your resume with as many recent, relevant, and current experiences as you can. But then second to that, especially as it relates to those personal reasons for either leaving a job, not having a job, etc., I always try to encourage people to be as honest and transparent in both their cover letter and then their interviews. So of course, we don't want to dive too deeply into our personal lives, just because sometimes that negatively impacts an employer's perception of you. But what I would recommend is touching on those things, right? So for example, I have a really good, story to go with this is actually my mother left the workforce for a very long time for being disabled for about 10 years. And so she's currently in her job search process, which great, it's during COVID, so it's not the easiest time to look for jobs anyway. But some of the things that we've done with her materials is putting in cover letters and saying, due to some health reasons, I was not able to enter the workforce in my full healthy capacity because of a disability. But since then, I have, remedied my health conditions, and I'm ready, prepared, and excited to work. Something that I did while I was disabled was I received a bachelor's degree in XYZ at this institution. And so that's kind of what we do in framing her health restrictions in being not being able to be employed for 10 years on her cover letter. And since, has received a few interviews over the phone in which she sort of discusses that as well in the interview, and just says, I've actually developed skills of resilience. I've also developed skills of problem solving and taking initiative and kind of taking control of my own life. And I think those are skills that I'll bring to this position. And so that's sort of how we frame the disability. And so that might be some sort of a case for somebody else who's experiencing health issues, personal reasons, maybe being a stay-at-home mom, and so on. So that's just an example of how you might frame some personal issues that inhibited your work history or your ability to work. Lynn, does that sort of touch on what you were asking? And I know that there was a question in the chat.
Yeah, that definitely takes care of the question I had. The question that's in the chat right now is can looking for a job while having a job be perceived negatively by human resources? I definitely think we should talk about this one now since it directly links to this myth. So I guess I can talk about it a little from the employer perspective, and then you can certainly tackle it from a career coach one. I would say, first off, my advice is, and Cash, you may certainly differ from this, I don't ever recommend disclosing that you're going through a job search to your current employer until it's necessary. So the step that it becomes necessary depends on sort of what you're doing. It might become necessary to talk to your direct supervisor if like you need a job reference or something like that. And if not, it's your decision to wait essentially to tell them until you need to provide notice if you are leaving that current employer. So from a human resources perspective, yes, I would say if they did know you were going through a career search, they could definitely look down on that as potentially a negative. But I think your decision to provide that information to them is your personal choice. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think my advice is very similar. So yeah, there are points within your job search in which you have to indicate to your current employer that you are seeking alternative, employment opportunities. For example, right, that new hiring team that you're submitting applications for may say, hey, can we contact your current supervisor? We need that communication to make our decision. And at which point you need to kind of make a decision, right? Will I lose my current job if I do something like that? And it's kind of all up to the discretion of your current employer. But as it relates to other employers, right? So like, does it look bad or perceived negatively by HR of the new employment opportunity if you're looking for a job while having a job? I would say no in that case, right? So when you're submitting applications to other organizations and for other jobs, it's actually more likely that you have a job right now than that you don't have a job. A lot of job seekers have jobs. HR representatives typically don't see this as a negative thing. So I would definitely not be discouraged by the hiring team who you're submitting applications for negatively perceiving you have a job. But when it comes to your current employer and the current HR team, it's just going to depend and vary on them personally, the organizational culture, and so on. So that sounds like it's kind of a bit of a sticky situation. So Christian, I definitely recommend you reaching out to either myself or Lynn so we can kind of further discuss this with you if you have a specific scenario that you need assistance with. But I hope that answers your question. I think this is a great time to transition to our next myth. Lynn, are you ready to go to the next one?
Yeah, that's perfect. Awesome. So our next myth is the ever popular one. I feel like I've heard this one constantly. Don't leave a job unless you have another job lined up. I mean, I feel like this was drilled into my head. Every time I look for something, a new opportunity, whatever it is, somebody's always like, well, make sure you don't leave your current opportunity unless you have another job. So this one was one that we were definitely wanted to tackle in this chat a little today. So similar to the other one, this is both true and false. So we'll start with the true aspects. So from a very real perspective, you may not want to leave your job because you need money. People need to pay bills and they have expenses and all of that sort of stuff. And so it may not be practical for you to leave your job until you have another job to go to. Because that stress of not having something might be a really big burden. How will you pay your bills? How will you support potentially family members or something along those lines if you don't have income coming in? From a networking perspective, it may be really beneficial for you to continue to have your job that you are currently in and then go to directly to another role. From a networking perspective, it shows that you are still really invested in building important connections, and it can make it a really smooth transition, just going straight from one opportunity into another. The longer too, obviously, that you stay in a job, the more skills you gain. Even if a job isn't ideal or exactly the perfect fit for what it is you're hoping to do, or maybe is a progressive step towards the job you're hoping to get, you're still learning. So it may be really advantageous to hold on to that current job until you have something, because you'll continue to learn skills that you need for your next opportunity. And similar to that, you're still gaining industry experience. You have more time that you're spending in your field. You are working in that industry and continuing to build your experiences before you move into the next step. So having that lapse in employment could be a really difficult step. So from that aspect, it may be true that you should not leave your current job unless you have another opportunity to go for. But I'm sure that Cass has plenty of examples for why this is false also.
Love that. Yeah, right. The dichotomy of it all. On the side of this being false, the first reason why, you might want to leave a job before having another one lined up is just with that inflexibility of time, right? So if you work an 8 to 5 and interviews and phone calls and negotiations and things like that happen 8 to 5, it may be really challenging to figure out how to schedule interviews for a job if you have one. Other times, right, maybe you work the night shift and you have an interview the next day, you may not be able to bring your best foot forward. And so sometimes leaving a job could be better for you without another one lined up, again, to just be able to dedicate your full attention and time to that job search process. Secondly, on the same vein, right, conflicting priorities can really affect your ability to find a job if you already have one. So projects and time at work can consume your preparation for interviews and job searching, and ultimately maybe lead to, again, you not being able to put your best foot forward. This isn't to say that if you have a job, you're not going to get a job if you're looking for another one, but this may be a reason why this statement happens to be false. Thirdly, and we just touched on this sort of when we were on the last slide, and Christian sort of brought the question to us, which thank you for asking that. Your leadership right now may not be in support of your search. And so your supervisor, your leader, your manager, et cetera, may not respect you looking for other work, which could potentially pose challenges for you in your search. And so ultimately, in maybe your specific situation, not having a job without having another one lined up could actually benefit you, making this statement false. And then lastly, so if you're making a career transition or you're changing fields, you may not need the current job that you have to prove that you have that experience because it's in a different arena. So the hiring managers that you're looking for positions in may understand oh, you left that job without having another one lined up right away because you were making a career shift. So that makes a lot of sense. You wanted to dedicate yourself to this new career or industry. And so I think that's, some of the major reasons why this statement or this myth can be both a myth and not a myth, true and false. Sometimes leaving a job might be important for you without having another one lined up. And everyone's situation is very different, which is actually why most of these career myths happen to be both true and false, because everyone has a different and diverse experience in their job search and in having a job, leaving a job, lining up a job, etc. So those are some of the things that we wanted to share with you on this myth. Lynn, any other final thoughts or things that you wanted to ask questions about related to this topic?
Yes, I have 2 follow-up questions. So question number 1, how can you, if you are maybe in a rather inflexible day job, how can you balance needing to take interviews or needing time away from your current job in order to take those interviews for another role? And then supplemental to that, how can you have that conversation with your current employer about why you may need some time away or time off? What do you say to them if you're taking time off for an interview?
Oh boy.
Big question.
Yeah. So I think it first ultimately comes down to, what does your relationship with your current job, organization, company, and your current supervisor look like, right? What is that relationship? So it's easy, right, to answer this question when your supervisor is so supportive of your professional development and you looking for other opportunities. And so then, you just say, hey, I'm going to need to take time off for this interview. And you go through the correct processes to do so. But it's not always simple like that. More often than not, it's not that simple, right? So my recommendation when I meet with people as a career coach, to balance this need to take interviews and the need to like perform your duties in your current role, and then also further having that conversation, is determining what sort of worst case scenario looks like for you. Right. So worst case scenario, I mean, you lose your current job, right? That's typically the worst case. And then kind of going back in time to figure out, how can I make sure that that doesn't happen? So does it include a conversation with your current supervisor saying, hey, I am seeking other opportunities. I hope you can understand. Here are the reasons why. And, please let me know what I can do to kind of make this transition smooth. Maybe that just looks like you take time off in your portal where you request time off, or you email your supervisor and say, hey, I'm taking XYZ amount of time off. And that's just what it looks like for you at your job. You don't have to kind of give a reason. Maybe you do, a day off in terms of a sick day, an annual leave, whatever, right? Maybe it's simple for you in that respect. So kind of go to worst case scenario and then take steps back until you get to a space where you can do something that you don't get to worst case scenario. I know that sounds kind of complicated, but that's what I always do with people, as I say, okay, well, first, do you feel like you can have a conversation with your current supervisor, manager, leader about the fact that you're looking for other work? If the answer is no, right, we look at alternatives. If the answer is yes, well, simple enough. We figure out how to have that conversation, talk about some key talking points, and have that conversation. If that's not something that you can do, I always recommend seeking the support of maybe respected or trusted colleagues. Maybe they're not at your current company, but they're in a similar industry or have been in a similar space, and being able to lean into them for advice in this scenario, right? Because every industry is different, every employer is different. And so if you could kind of tap into some resources or some mentors or colleagues that have had a similar experience or have some advice for you, I always recommend that. But then lastly, I think as long as you are able to take time off, try to explain to who you are applying for jobs with that I'm currently employed a full-time job. I'm very dedicated to looking for a job at this company, but as you may know, I need this job to supplement my income before actually moving into your company. So like explaining that to the hiring manager as well and saying, I'm trying to be as flexible as possible, but these are the only times I'm able to make it, and see if you can kind of negotiate it that way with the hiring manager as well. So there's a lot of different factors that kind of play into these questions that you asked, Lynn, but hopefully that kind of provides a little bit of context for some of the strategies that you could implement. But again, if you're struggling with this, I highly recommend tapping into career services, people like myself and our other career coaches, to kind of talk about how to negotiate this. What are some action steps in this potential situation, and how can we kind of help you in that process or journey?
Awesome. So I have one more question. At what point do you decide to tell your current employer that you'll be leaving your current position?
So this is a fun one. So I have been in this situation before. I've had colleagues in this situation before, and I've also had, students and alumni in this situation. And my recommendation to most people is I would probably not indicate to your current employer that you have either found or are looking for another opportunity until you've been given an offer, if you can wait that long, right? So you want that offer, especially in writing, if you can get it. So you can either leverage things with your current employer, or you can just say, respectfully, I've enjoyed my time at this company, but I've been given this other offer. Like here I'm going on to my next opportunity. So I try to recommend to wait as long as possible, not to be dishonest. And of course, if you want to be honest and upfront and you have that relationship with your supervisor, you can let them know at whatever point you're most comfortable and confident in that decision to tell them. However, if that's not the case for you, which it's not the case for many people, I always recommend waiting as long as humanly possible, especially up until the point where you have an offer, to see if you're able to just, let them know when you've actually received that secured offer for the new employment opportunity. Lynn, you might have other perspectives on this, but that's what I typically recommend if the best case scenario allows for it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, that's very similar to the advice that I would give. And I just coached a good friend and colleague of mine through this process because she was trying really hard to try to figure out how to balance, very competing factors with this. Wanting to preserve the relationship with her current employer and give them enough time to transition her out of her role, and also wanting to move to her next position. She was excited to move on to this next step, and trying to figure out how to balance all of this was really difficult. So I would say the only thing I would add to what you mentioned is if there are like employment verification steps that need to be taken, even after the point of you getting the offer, I would wait until those have been completed. So what I mean by that is if you're going to be in a position that needs like a background check, or security clearances or something along those lines, I would wait until those finished. Not to say that I'm sure there's going to be something that pops up in your history that'll force them to take back the offer. But I do know people who had something unexpected happen in their background check process, or it took longer than what they were expecting. And so there was an unexpected period of unemployment because they were waiting for factors to clear and they had already made the decision to leave their current employment. So I think that's something really important to keep in mind when you're making that decision of how much essential notice you give your current employer.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Before we transition to the next and final myth and topic, are there any questions from our audience today? Anything that's kind of circulating or things that are on your mind that you'd like to ask about before we sort of move to our third and final myth today? Again, I'm going to do that awkward pause. Lynn's mic is unmuted, so maybe I'll get a nice little giggle, but kind of
You're doing great. You're doing great.
Ramble through to allow you to ask your questions. If not, we will have time at the end. So, jot down any questions maybe you're thinking about, and we'll address those as you ask them.
And obviously people don't know what our third myth is, but if there was something you were hoping we were going to tackle as a topic in this and we didn't, you can totally drop that in there too.
Yeah, and I gave them a sneak peek by transitioning the slide to the next myth. So they do indeed know. So this is our third and final myth. So again, if there's things that, you wanted us to cover that maybe we haven't already, definitely drop those in the chat. But our final myth today is that you have to stay in a job for blank amount of time, right? Some people say 2 years, some people say 5 years, right? It depends on who's saying it ultimately and what industry they're in. But you have to stay in a job for X amount of time. This statement is, of course, both true and false. Again, we love a good double-edged sword, right? So since we've had Lynn do the truth for all 2 so far, we're going to just keep that theme and have Lynn finally cover the truth of this myth.
Perfect. I love that. Consistency is key. So this is another one that I think everybody can relate to. We hear this stuff all the time, like you have to stay here for a certain amount of time, or people will think blank about you. So from a true aspect, jumping around or having really choppy work history where you're working someplace for a month and then 6 months and then another place for 4 months, like it makes you, honestly, I wish I could use a better word, but a lot of the time it can make you look really flaky. It makes you look unreliable to them. And it emphasizes things about your character that may be true or they may be false, but that there isn't really a good way to explain to an employer outside of taking steps like in your cover letter or potentially in an interview to explain why you have a really choppy work history. And Cass is going to talk about, some examples of situations where having a choppy work history is justified, but it's a really challenging topic to navigate. And so if you can avoid it, generally it's a good idea. The rule or the best practice on how long to stay in a position, it really depends on what field and industry you're in. It can drastically vary from, a year to 2 years to what Cass was saying, to 5 years. It can just really depend upon what industry you're in. But she'll also talk about some ways that you can navigate if you need out of your current role prior to that. If you're in a position where you're an intern or an apprentice, or you're earning hours towards a certification, leaving your internship or apprenticeship may literally disqualify you from seeking future employment in your desired field. That's fine if you're like, man, I really don't want to do this. And jumping out is going to allow you to do something else. But if you're looking to keep going in that field, it can look really bad on your resume and also make it take a lot longer before you can seek, that end goal full-time employment that you're hoping for. Sort of similar to what I was talking about, it may prove that you are a little unreliable. An employer is taking a chance on you by bringing you into their company, and they don't want to depend on somebody who's unreliable. A hiring process is a commitment by an employer, from the time a position is posted to when they're onboarding somebody. On average, it takes about 6 months. And so they've invested 6 months of their company's time of not having somebody to do this work. And then they bring somebody in and hope that they're going to stay. And then you jump out, and it's pretty disappointing to them. Because of that, it can really damage your professional relationship. They always say, like, everybody knows everybody. And I think that's, like, especially true here in Las Vegas. It's like the biggest small city, but large town I've ever lived in. Everyone knows each other. And if you are somebody who leaves a job without whatever is perceived to be the right amount of time, it could damage your professional relationships and make it really hard for you to find another job. People change companies and they move to other places, and you never know when you're going to cross paths with that person from your last company that you only worked at for 2 months, and they remember you, and it could negatively impact their like perception of you entirely in that new job. So there is definitely some truth to this myth that you have to stay in a job for a certain amount of time. But as expected, Cass is going to talk about some situations and examples when this is not true, when getting out is totally fine.
Yeah, I think all of those things, right, make this myth true and not a myth. And so I'll kind of talk about why this myth might be false. So first and foremost, the gig economy is very popular, right? So your experience may be more freelance or more of like a gig in nature. And so the time blocks on your resume may be very flaky in a sense, or maybe very quick in a sense, because that's the nature of the type of work that you do. Maybe you do consulting, freelance, gig work. And so ultimately it doesn't really matter how long you stay in a particular job, because that's just not the nature of how you work. And the gig economy, again, is very popular these days, making that more common on a resume. Secondly, a job could just be a bad fit for you, right? You may be, and maybe not that you're a bad fit for the company, but that particular position, company, organization that you're a part of just doesn't vibe with you and your professional development and is ultimately preventing you from growing. So you may leave a position because it was unhealthy, not helpful, or prevented you from growing. And so that's why you weren't there for 2 years or 5 years or however long that X amount of time is. And ultimately, you can explain that away, right, on a cover letter, resume, et cetera, in the interview. Thirdly, relocation is more likely to be a huge factor in this. So maybe you move for a partner, a family member, a sickness. Maybe you move because the nature of your, partner's job moves them around a lot, potentially, being a military spouse or something along those lines. So you may have moved or needed to relocate often for specific reasons, and that could be why you don't have that like X amount of time. And so that makes it a little bit false because you have extenuating circumstances. Same in terms of changing circumstances, again, partners, family, conflicting responsibilities. So, right, sometimes life happens and you have to relocate, or you have to take leave from a particular position because of something that's going on. And those are things that, again, we sort of talked about maybe explaining away in your cover letter, talking about, hey, a family member fell ill. I have a really great example of this. I was working with an individual, a political science, young professional who was looking for an internship. And he had personal ailments that kind of impacted his educational history and his ability to find a job. And then secondly, he had a family member pass away and get sick that he was taking care of. And so those were huge factors as to why, number one, his academic record wasn't very strong for a certain amount of time. But then number two, that he took some time away from any type of employment. So what we did was we kind of created a short paragraph on his cover letter to explain this. And all of the hiring managers and teams who were looking at his materials were, even in the interview said, like, thank you so much for being transparent about your life circumstances and changing circumstances that kind of prevented you from being able to engage in work during X amount of time. We really wanted to bring you in for an interview regardless, so on and so forth. And then he actually ended up landing an internship, which transitioned into a full-time job. So sometimes being honest in both the interview as well as that cover letter can be very critical for you in your search as the circumstances of things change. And then lastly, I know this chart wasn't completely balanced in the sense, so there are more false than true, but the economy and hiring trends change all the time. We're living in a industry, economy, and hiring change right now. You could be laid off due to the economy, which many, many, many people were. And so maybe you had that job for 5 months and you were laid off because of COVID. That's something that's easily explained, both on your resume, actually. You can create a bullet point to say laid off due to COVID-19, an economic downturn. But secondly, you can explain it in your interview. You can explain it in your cover letter and so on. But then also hiring demands and just hiring practices frequently change and shift all the time. So budgets at specific companies can change, which make your time frame in a specific job maybe be shortened because you were laid off or because they did changes among the organizational structure of your company. So maybe you were a customer service representative for 3 months and then they transitioned you to valet. That doesn't mean that you didn't stay in a job for X amount of time, so you're a poor candidate. It just means that some structural or organizational issues occurred at your company, and so you had to move roles. And that's even something that could sort of impact the false or true nature of this statement. So I think that's really great for the dichotomy of this particular myth. Lynn, do you have any follow-up questions? I'm sure you do for kind of the topic at hand.
You knew it. You read my mind. So this is a really complicated one. This is one of those hard myths because there's so many factors at play, and it has so much to do with like people's personal status and family status and personal characteristics and all sorts of stuff plays into this one. So the question I have is also understandably probably a little bit complicated, but I'm sure you can totally tackle this one. So when somebody is going through a hiring practice or a hiring process, we always hope that employers are like evaluating candidates fairly and like not taking into account like their relationship status or if they have children or, that sort of stuff. But how can you balance the need to disclose those things to explain your job history while also not giving them a reason not to hire you?
Mm.
And it's fine if you don't have like a perfect answer for this one. It's just I struggle trying to figure out a good answer to this question. And so I'm really curious to hear your thoughts.
Okay. So I have some thoughts. It's a very complicated question with a lot of different answers. I think the first thing is in your job search, what I always recommend you do is kind of look up the mission, values, culture of that company, and kind of see, who's working at those organizations. What does it seem like their, perception of, family is, perception of, marriage, all those things. And obviously there's some things that you can't find out online about a company, but you'll be able to find a lot about the accepting nature of a company by looking them up online, looking at reviews of positions at that company, talking to some people who work there via like LinkedIn or sending them an email and different things like that. So I would first start with researching more and more about that company. And then also in turn, some of those people that you're interacting with in the interview stages, right? So maybe you go in for your first interview, you meet with the hiring manager, a customer service representative, and so on. And then maybe look those people up on LinkedIn and kind of try to figure out a little bit more about them, their company culture, perceptions, etc. Second to that is I always say in terms of disclosing things about yourself that maybe prevented you to have an extensive work history or, forced you to take time off or whatever your situation or condition is, I always say only give them as much information as they need, right? So for example, if you have a particular illness or ailment, but it doesn't impact your ability to do the job, you don't necessarily need to disclose what that either disability is or what that illness is or what that, pre-existing condition is. But instead you may say, I have a pre-existing condition. It doesn't impact my ability to perform the roles and responsibilities of this position. I can confidently say that. However, in the past, it has, prevented me from furthering opportunities and work experiences. So maybe you disclose, but you only disclose key pieces of information that they'll need that won't allow them to discriminate against you. And again, like you said, we hope that employers are evaluating candidates fairly, but that's not always the case. So what I recommend in that space of disclosure is try to disclose only the features of information that are going to be important. So I took time off because I had a health condition. You don't have to say I had cancer. You don't have to say a family member did. You don't have to say necessarily what it was if you're not comfortable. But instead, you may say, there was a health reason that prevented me from being in the workforce. And now that has been, I have now found abilities to work through that, or have now overcome that health condition. And then lastly is, you also don't necessarily want to work for or with a company who is not accepting of some of those identity features of yourself. So maybe it isn't an illness or a disability or what have you, but potentially it is, family status. Or maybe you caregive for a parent, and you don't want necessarily to work at a company who isn't supportive of that lifestyle because that's your lifestyle. And so being hesitant in that respect as well, in knowing, they may not like this information, but do you want to work at a company that doesn't respect you for who you are and what identities you hold? So that's what I have, in that case. It's very, very complex, and probably a lot more complex than what I shared, but hopefully that dove in just a little bit to kind of answer your question as best as I could. Yeah.
I think I'm sending you all the virtual snaps on that one, because I tackled you with a really hard question. I don't know a lot of like human resources professionals that have like a perfect answer to that, but I think you nailed it. So I want to address a topic that came up in the chat a little bit, but so one of our participants, they were forced to unfortunately leave a position due to some unreasonable expectations from their employer. They were balancing an academic workload, and, the employer started pushing them for more and more time outside of what they were comfortable providing and able to provide. Looking at this situation, how would you approach that? Like, how do you communicate that the expectations are not what you would initially agree to, and push and advocate for yourself to have a situation that is fair and manageable?
Yeah. So I think if, you're definitely trying to stay in that position, it all comes down to negotiation. There's so much research out there about leveraging negotiation and different kind of best practices for negotiating whatever that may be. And so I definitely recommend you looking up a little bit more about negotiation and the power of leveraging different things as it relates to trying to kind of push back against those unrealistic expectations. But if you find yourself in a position where you end up just quitting that job because they're not understanding, or you were able to push back through these unrealistic expectations, I would just explain this in your job search, right? And again, in those materials that we've talked about, like the cover letter, in your interview, right? So they may ask you the question, why did you leave your most recent position? And what I would say is, in going through the job search process for that position, I indicated to the employer that I am a full-time student, and one of my biggest responsibilities and greatest responsibilities at this time is being a full-time student. And so 20 hours is sort of the max. And they agreed to that situation. And unfortunately, after a few months of being there, there was a challenge in meeting that expectation of 20 hours and no more than 20 hours. So I was forced to leave that position just because I am very dedicated to my education. But that's where I bring, resiliency to this position, the ability to have conversations with my, supervisor and colleagues that are difficult, so that I can overcome something like this in the future. So, I still hope that you give me this opportunity in this position, right? So that's what I would say in an interview or in a cover letter, if this was the situation that you experienced. I rambled a little bit on that. I definitely felt that, but I hope that kind of answers the question and the situation.
Yeah, I think you touched on some really important stuff with that. It's important for you to figure out whether it's something you can take steps to try to fix and whether it's, frankly worth it to try to push back and stay in that workplace, or whether you need to see sort of the writing on the wall and leave, I think is a hard conversation. And, I see there's a comment coming into, how can you tell your boss that what they're doing isn't right or complain to them, but, still balance not getting fired from your job. So, I mean, that's like a very difficult conversation of, balancing those factors and advocating for yourself, but also not upsetting them so much that they choose to fire you, so it's like, I think it's a really difficult topic. And I think your recommendation to, seek some resources regarding negotiation and sort of that stuff is a really good one. So you answered the question perfectly, I think. But I don't have any follow-up questions, but I definitely, if our audience has any thoughts, we do have a little bit of open time for some Q&A as we're finishing out our presentation. So if there was a myth you were hoping we would tackle, or if you have questions or something like that, you can feel free to throw them in there, and we'll do that lovely, weird, awkward pause. And if not, then we can go ahead and wrap up the session. So we'll give it just a little time. So if anybody has any thoughts that they were hoping that we would talk about or anything like that.
Yeah, and I think with that, now is a really good time to just be able to throw up at least our contact information, our website, etc. So we're going to actually drop this survey into the chat once again, just so you could totally take a look at that, fill that out, let Lynn and I know how we did and how we can improve moving forward, because we want this to be very helpful and useful for our students, alumni, and everyone who participates. We do have a lot of really awesome, thank you, Christian. We have a lot of really awesome resources on our website. I definitely recommend you check those out. One being our career toolkit that has a lot of resources, handouts, guides for lots of different things related to your career development. If you do need to make an appointment with anyone in our office, please book an appointment through Handshake. If you're unable to do so, you can contact Lynn or myself, and we can kind of direct you to the right place. So I'll drop my email address in the chat box. I'll drop Lynn's. And then Lynn, if you could actually go ahead and drop the 2 links, the YouTube channel and the book an appointment. Oh, and I guess our website as well, along with, you already dropped the survey. That would be awesome. And then we'll kind of wrap up if there's no final questions. And of course, I want to thank you all for your time. Maybe it got rambly at times, but I hope it was still beneficial for you in your development, wherever you might be in life and in your career journey. I appreciate you all coming, and by you all, I mean all 2 of you, but thank you so much for being here.
And like we said in the beginning too, we did record this and it'll be posted on that YouTube channel probably certainly by the end of the week. So if you thought that this presentation was awesome, feel free to share it with somebody else, or just keep it in your back pocket in case you need it. But it's always going to be there in the recorded form if you want to come back and revisit it. Awesome. You want to close this up, Cass?
Yeah, thank you so much for participating in this week's edition of Career Mythbusters. We love busting a good myth, a good career myth. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. Thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure virtually meeting all of you, and we hope to see you again at future sessions.